Alright, we're going to be talking about speed and calculating average speed today, so let's go ahead and get started. So you can follow along with your worksheet and fill things out as we go. But before we get started on that, I want you to think about this. So what is the name given to a stationary object as it relates to motion? And there are two possible answers, and we've already talked about these in a previous lesson, so hopefully you know. So give it a moment to think about it. And if you thought it was either reference point or reference frame, you would be absolutely correct. Good job. Speed, let's talk about speed. So here you see we've got a picture of a cheetah and Usain Bolt, the world's fastest man. And we know that speed is basically the distance traveled divided by the time interval during which that motion occurred. So in a more mathematical and simplified version, you can see that speed is equal to the distance divided by time. We can shorten that to S. Actually, we tend to use V there, but we'll get to that later. But speed equals distance divided by time. S equals D divided by T. So different objects or things can move at very different speeds. And we know that a cheetah's top speed is a lot faster than a human's top speed. In fact, a cheetah is one of the fastest organisms in the world, at least as far as warm-blooded organisms go. And when we measure speed, we basically need to figure out or measure the distance traveled and the time it took to travel that distance. Again, brings us right back to the same formula. Speed equals distance divided by time. So we can use a number of different units when we describe speed. In fact, you're probably very familiar with this last one here, miles per hour. We all tend to write it as mph, but technically it's mi divided by h, or miles per hour is how it's said. We also have meters per second, that's ms, and that happens to be our SI unit, by the way. Meters per second is this international standard unit of measurement for speed. We also have kilometers per hour. If you go to Canada, if you visit Niagara Falls and go to the Canadian side, you'll encounter kilometers per hour. Or if you go over to Europe, there you will also encounter kilometers per hour, because we're one of the few countries in the world that still hasn't switched over to using metric. We'll get there someday, hopefully. So there's this idea of constant speed that you need to be aware of. And the idea of constant speed is that an object is covering the same distance in equal amounts of time. So little snapshots of time. In each of those little time intervals, the same amount of distance gets covered. So that would be a constant speed. So for instance, if these motorcycles here, these race bikes, we're racing at a constant speed of 96 meters every single second, which would be 96 meters per second, then you could say these bikes are at a constant speed. However, we know that it's very rare that an object would move at a constant speed. So we have to take chunks of the time intervals and create basically an average speed. And we're going to get to that. But let's talk for a minute about speedometers in your car. So speedometers have a cable that spins based on how fast the tires are spinning, and it translates that into a number that we can read on a gauge. And it's basically taking very quick intervals of time and calculating the distance traveled. So we're talking like milliseconds. So a speedometer is probably one of the few things that would give you a close to a constant speed, because it's reading that every single click of the wheel as it turns in very, very short time increments. It's calculating that. So a speedometer is close to being what we would consider a constant speed, but it's still kind of averages out in the end. So when we're looking at average speed, We do so because we know that speed isn't a constant. Speed changes all the time. So we have to basically calculate the average of those speed changes to come up with basically a speed. So average speed describes motion that's changing in speed all the time. So average speed is the distance that's traveled by an object, and then it gets divided by the time that the object takes to travel that distance. And so this sounds like the same thing as speed. Well, it basically is, because when we're talking about speed, we're really talking about average speed. If we were talking about constant speed, we would have to specify constant speed. But when we're talking about average speed, we often don't say the word average, we just say speed, and what we mean by that is average speed. So just so it's not confusing. So here's our equation. We're looking at it again. We know that speed gets divided by the distance over the time it takes to travel that distance. And when we put it in short form, we want to use a v, which is more akin to velocity, if you want to think about it that way. But we can't use the s because the s tends to stand for seconds, which is a standard unit of measure. So we can't use s, so we have to use v. So v equals d divided by time. And you're going to have an opportunity to apply this formula. So if you take a wheelchair racer and he finishes 132 meters in 18 seconds, what is the average speed? Well, we use the formula for v equals distance divided by time. So we take the distance, 132, we divide it by the time, which is 18 seconds. And that gives us an answer of 7.3 meters per second. This example is in your worksheet, so you now have the answer to that. But it's also already in there for you anyway. So always when you're writing down calculations using formulas, you always want to include your units. So in this case, because we're dividing meters by seconds, we end up with meters divided by seconds over here. So the way that we say that when there's a slash in between them is meters, the first word. Oops, didn't mean to click. We say meters per, the slash line means per, and then we say seconds for whatever that symbol means. So you're going to use this presentation as a reference to complete the average speed portion of the worksheet, which is called homework in your worksheet. There are 4 questions in there that ask you to calculate the speed, or technically the average speed, and shouldn't be any problem for you wizards. Alright, see you tomorrow.